U.S. presidential race gathers steam, questions about the candidate's position on foreign policy remain. To illustrate the difference between Senator Obama and Senator McCain, Pepe Escobar speaks to senior news analyst Aijaz Ahmad.
Aijaz, how would you compare McCain's and Obama's foreign policy approaches, considering the latest speeches and what they've been saying for the past few months?
Essentially, I think the fundamental difference between the two of them concerns Iraq. McCain basically wants to extend the Bush policy as it now exists, whereas Obama is saying he will drastically reduce the number of troops inside Iraq. He does not say anything about withdrawing the contractors who are as numerous in Iraq now as there are troops. He says he's going to keep a large enough force, military force inside Iraq to protect U.S. strategic interests in the area. He's completely silent on the question of the air war. And as we have seen even in the last few days in Basra and Baghdad, when the al-Maliki government deployed its troops, the US Air Force came in to do fairly devastating bombings. His supporters are not going into those kinds of details. Some people, not necessarily his core supporters, are criticizing Obama for not talking about the corporate takeover of Iraq. So basically the way it is shaping up is large enough force continues in the name of counter-terrorism. Bulk of the armed forces are deployed perhaps to regions nearby. Meanwhile, he'll rebuild the armed forces, give them another 100,000 troops for better and more efficient interventions in Iraq and elsewhere. It's a fairly belligerent position.
Let's talk about Iran. Is Obama specific about Iran?
In his latest speech, he says either Iran gives up its nuclear program, gives up support for terrorism, by which he means Hamas and Hezbollah, and stops its opposition to Israel, in which case it will be readmitted to the Committee of Nations, or there will be deeper sanctions, deeper isolation, and there may be a moment of military action, which we will undertake only after diplomacy has been deployed. Now, I don't see what is the fundamental difference between this and the position of the Bush administration.
This is more or less the Bush administration light.
This is Bush administration somewhat light, only to the extent that he talks about meeting the Irani leadership, for which he has got a lot of flack, but the fundamental positions are the same, and he does not distinguish himself from McCain on any of these issues.
Is Obama specific about Pakistan in any of his speeches?
Well, first of all, he not only talks about Al-Qaeda in his latest speech, he talks about decimating the Taliban. He says he's going to send, to start with, 2 more US brigades into Afghanistan. He will act with or without the support of the Pakistan government if he has actionable intelligence. This is again not very different from what Bush is actually doing. There are daily bombings in northwestern Pakistan today. And this is very, very dangerous, Pepe, because the new provincial government that has been elected in NWFP has already opened a dialogue with Taliban and says openly it is the declared policy of that NWFP government to be in dialogue with Taliban rather than seek a military solution. So it will bring Obama directly in conflict with the democratically elected government which is now in place in Pakistan. This is very dangerous talk.
Let's go to Palestine now. Is Obama specific on how to solve the the broader Arab-Israeli conflict?
I'm very surprised. I think that is the weakest part of his foreign policy position. He does not even talk much of the so-called peace process and the two-state solution. He simply keeps talking about Iran and being a threat to Israel. In his latest speech, he says something quite remarkable, which is that the root of the problem in the Middle East is not what Israel does, but in radical, fanatical, irrational Islam. Now, this radical, fanatical, irrational Islam, if that's what it is barely 10, 15 years old. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is 60 years old. This is a very, very worrisome position that he takes.
What will Obama do vis-à-vis China?
Virtually the only reference that I could find to China in his speeches is in the recent one in which he talks about how the United States should defend human rights everywhere in the world, starting with Tibet, he says. He doesn't mention any other country. Everybody wants human rights in Tibet. He is so cautious on the question of China, and the other elephant in the room is Russia. The biggest question in Europe today is expansion of NATO, the bringing in of Georgia and Ukraine into NATO, which Bush is insisting on, and the putting of US missiles very close to the border. And Putin has said that if that is done, then Russia will have to target those states. And Obama's foreign policy statements so far simply do not address either of these two great questions.